History as it happens, February 17th, 2022. Biden and the betrayal of Yemen.
This war has to end.
Just 2 months ago, the Biden administration approved $500 million worth of arms, including maintenance for attack helicopters that are used in Yemen.
Unconstitutional, unjustified, and ultimately immoral war has repeatedly come up over the last year.
The current situation in Yemen is the worst humanitarian disaster on earth.
There are no U.S. troops on the ground in Yemen, but our nation is nonetheless involved in one of the world's cruelest wars. The U.S. continues to back Saudi Arabia's campaign to drive Houthi rebels from power, 7 years after they seized Yemen's capital. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have died. Millions are on the edge of starvation. Yet the Biden administration still backs the Saudis, making our nation complicit in their crimes. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The fact that over the past 12 months, the U.S. only sold some attack helicopters and air-to-air missiles, again, just signals the fact that the U.S. continues to support what Saudi Arabia is doing because the Biden administration does remain concerned about Iran.
In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act to check the executive from waging war with little to no congressional approval or consultation, after the debacle of Vietnam and Nixon's secret bombing of neutral Cambodia. The act has never been successfully invoked to end a foreign military adventure, not once. Although in recent years, a bipartisan majority in Congress tried multiple times to end U.S. involvement in a civil war in a small country at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula.
According to the United Nations, Yemen is at risk of the most severe famine in more than 100 years.
Today we have the opportunity to override the veto in pursuit of justice, prudence, and upholding the constitutionally mandated separation of powers. This is one of the most important fundamental features of our constitutional system. Congress, and Congress alone, may declare war.
3 times President Trump vetoed bills that would have ended arms sales to the Saudis, who intervened in Yemen's civil war in 2015. In 2018, Trump explained why he supported the Saudis and their crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, even after the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment and other things from Russia and China.
Well, give Trump this much. He didn't bother with the usual BS about protecting democracy and human rights. But anyway, when Joseph Biden succeeded Trump in the White House, opponents of the war welcomed the new president's pledge.
And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
A year later, the administration has not fulfilled its promise. As Congress members Pramila Jayapal and Peter DeFazio wrote in an op-ed in The Nation, in 2021, the administration provided over $1 billion in weaponry to Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. continues to provide logistical support that's essential to the Saudi Air Force's deadly bombings. In other words, the difference between offensive and defensive weapons is close to meaningless.
Unfortunately, that offensive-defensive distinction has ended up doing a lot of work.
Dr. Annelle Sheline is an expert on Yemen at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and she'll join us in a moment. So we're not here to pick sides in Yemen's civil war. The country's history is one of enormous complexity. The question of who should govern Yemen is a difficult one to answer. The country was once ruled by Ali Abdullah Saleh, a military man who ruled the country of North Yemen beginning in 1978. American citizens probably gave Yemen little, if any, thought until October 12, 2000.
First, as you know, an explosion claimed the lives of at least 4 sailors on one of our naval vessels, the USS Cole, this morning. Many were injured. A number are still missing.
According to the Council on Foreign Relations, after the al-Qaeda bombing of the USS Cole, the United States provided Yemen more than $850 million in military aid, citing the online database Security Assistance Monitor. And after 9/11, Yemen became another battlefield in the global war on terrorism, a place where presidents could order airstrikes to assassinate militants instead of sending in the Marines to do it. Iran's role in providing support to the Houthi rebels further complicates things. It's one big reason why many members of Congress say the U.S. must continue to support the Saudis.
But suffice it to say that this is another proxy war being conducted against the U.S. and its allies by Iran.
And we should also note Yemen's geopolitical importance. Its southwest corner juts into the Bab al-Mandab Strait at the convergence of the Gulf of Aden or Aden and the Red Sea. The U.S. role here raises a deeper question. As American hegemony wanes, as its power to produce desired outcomes through the use of military force evaporates, is there no part of the globe too insignificant for U.S. intervention? A similar question could have been asked during the Cold War when the United States meddled in the affairs of tiny, powerless Central American countries to stop them from going communist, ignoring local histories and the unintended consequences of intervention, whether covert or overt. Today, in the name of fighting terrorism, the U.S. finds itself mired in intractable conflicts that produce more violence, more instability, and human suffering. Annelle Sheline is a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute and an expert on religious and political authority in that part of the globe. She's writing a book on how Arab monarchies since 9/11 have used their religious authority to maintain power and curry favor with the United States. Dr. Annelle Sheline, we welcome you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'll suggest to our listeners they may want to pull up a map of Yemen on their phone or desktop as they listen along. That may help as we discuss any geopolitical issues concerning this civil war. But let's start by briefly going over what's happening now. What began as a civil war years ago now involves outside powers and factions. Who controls the capital of Sana'a now?
So the Houthi rebels, who are known formally as Ansar Allah, or Partisans of God, they have controlled the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, since seizing control in 2014. And your listeners may have heard recent headlines about attacks on Abu Dhabi, for example, in the UAE, launched by the Houthis. 3 people were killed. Then General McKenzie was in the region to reassure the UAE. The U.S. is escalating American involvement in countering the Houthis. The Houthis hold control of the territory of Yemen where 80% of Yemen's population live, mostly concentrated in the former North Yemen, whereas the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which is largely in exile in Riyadh, control actually very little territory at this point.
And that's the government recognized by the United Nations as well?
Yes. So this is the government that has been nominally in power following the Arab Spring transition in Yemen. This is who the United States considers the legitimate government of Yemen. This is who the international community considers the legitimate government.
And the Houthis are from the northern, as you mentioned, the northern part of Yemen along the border with Saudi Arabia. It's often said that they're backed by Iran, but they are an indigenous rebellion.
They are. So the Houthi movement came about partly in resistance to Saudi Arabia had been trying to essentially Wahhabize, to make northern Yemen adopt more Salafi and specifically Wahhabi religious ideology. And the Houthis are Shia. They're a specific branch of Shia Islam known as Zaydi, which is distinct from the dominant form of Shiism in Iran. So although Iran does send support to the Houthis, there's sometimes a misperception that they are religiously on the same page. And even though they're both Shia, they ascribe to a different interpretation, which I think is important to keep in mind. The Houthi movement came about in resistance to this perceived Saudi religious meddling. The Houthis were also frustrated because the former president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, consolidated all power and resources in Sana'a. And so the region of Saada, where the Houthis are from on the border with Saudi Arabia, was historically quite impoverished, remained quite impoverished. And Saleh and the Houthis ended up fighting a series of wars in the early 2000s. And so already the Houthis were sort of seen as a headache for Yemen's central government. But at the time of the political transition following the Arab Spring, they were merely one of several dissatisfied groups inside Yemen.
So the Houthis control Sana'a and the area of the country where most of the people live, and we have this Saudi-led coalition trying to bomb them out of there. Who else is with the Saudis, in addition to the United States, which, of course, we are going to get to? That's the whole framing of this episode. Who else is with the Saudis?
Yes, so initially when Saudi Arabia intervened in March of 2015, after the Houthis had seized control of Sana'a, the former president's vice president, Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi, who had been instated as president as part of this transition process, he had actually overstayed the 2-year length of time that he was supposed to be president. He was still in power. That was one of the things that then precipitated the Houthis to storm Sana'a and eventually kick him out. The Saudis intervened with the help of most Arab countries. I think notably only Oman and Algeria were not part of this coalition. But the important actors for us to be aware of now, at this point, most countries have withdrawn. Egypt said they were going to send 10 Egyptian soldiers. I read that headline this morning
10.
To support. And Egypt has its own history of failure in Yemen. I mean, Yemen was sort of considered Nasser's Vietnam back in the 60s. So Egypt is not eager to get bogged down in Yemen. And I think Saudi is learning that lesson as well. But at this point, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the two main actors pushing back against the Houthis.
So a civil war that has regional implications and outside interference. We're going to return to these complexities on the ground today in a bit. Let's now go back in time some and familiarize our listeners with a little bit of recent history. The modern Yemeni state was formed in 1990. You mentioned Saleh. Despite his reputation as a corrupt autocrat, began receiving U.S. military aid in the early 2000s. That was the first time the United States started sending aid to Yemen. What prompted that? Was it the USS Cole attack by al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula?
That was definitely a key factor. So President Saleh was one of several Arab leaders who were very successful in, on the one hand, saying, oh, we've got a terrorist problem here. US, you should send us money. But then with that money, not actually addressing or, fully ousting the terrorist problem, because that would have ended the U.S. gravy train of military aid. And so from Saleh's perspective, Yemen has oil resources, but not anything close to what we observe in the really oil-rich Gulf monarchies. And Yemen's population is much bigger. And so Yemen is unfortunately a very poverty-stricken country. And Saleh was a deeply, deeply corrupt individual who siphoned millions, if not billions of dollars out of the country into foreign bank accounts. And so anyway, Saleh found it very useful for his purposes to ask for this US military aid. And so this was even more forthcoming after the al-Qaeda attack on the USS Cole, a destroyer warship that was off the coast of Aden, which is the most important Yemeni city in the south, in what was the most significant attack by al-Qaeda on an American target prior to 9/11. This happened in October of 2000. Obviously, then 9/11 also really boosted the amounts of military aid that the U.S. started sending to leaders like Saleh, who said that they were going to counteract groups like al-Qaeda, but who actually benefited from sort of low-level al-Qaeda activity.
Autocrats everywhere were happy to tell the United States after 9/11, well, we have a terrorism problem here too, send us money. You pronounce that Aden, the Gulf of Aden?
Yes.
Okay, I've been pronouncing it wrongly for years. I mentioned people bringing up the map on their screen. They can see that important pinch point there between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, where so much of the world's oil flows. You mentioned Yemen having some oil resources, but its location there is also why it's important to outside countries as well, right?
Yes, so it's part of it is oil flows, but it's also just the access. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is that the pinch point sort of between the Horn of Africa there and the southwest edge of the Arabian Peninsula, which is the southern access to the Red Sea, which goes up to the Suez Canal, and then obviously the Mediterranean and Europe. To get back to some of the geopolitical considerations, this is a big part of why the UAE is so interested in Yemen, and particularly in South Yemen. To get back to some more Yemeni history, Yemen was divided, that there was a Zaydi, again, the Houthis are Zaydi Shia, there was a Zaydi Imam in power in the former North Yemen, whereas the southern part of Yemen, because it is at such a strategically crucial rate, for a long time was a British colony. Later then became one of the only socialist Arab republics, was receiving support from the USSR. When the USSR fell apart, South Yemen was no longer really able to function, and at that point unified with North Yemen in 1990. The Southerners found actually that this was not a satisfactory deal and revolted in 1994 to reassert their independence, and were forced to remain as part of a unified Yemen because President Saleh had the military, essentially. Even though South Yemen has more of the resources and is geographically larger, it has a smaller population and didn't have the military resources. And so ever since 1994, you've had this dynamic where there are many people in South Yemen who resent the control by the North. And again, as I said, Saleh consolidated resources and power in Sana'a and around himself.
So the Arab Spring protests come along in 2011. They spread to Yemen. But there were already signs of trouble in the country as early as 2007, right? Sit-ins, demonstrations against the Saleh government. And those were signs of an open rebellion on the way, maybe?
Yes. So Yemen is really quite interesting. On the Arabian Peninsula, every other country there is a monarchy, and they all have pretty massive oil resources. Oman's resources being somewhat less, but still allowing for a functional, relatively wealthy country. Whereas Yemen, historically, because Yemen had actually the possibility of agriculture, Yemen has a wet season and a dry season. The Romans called it Arabia Felix, happy Yemen, or happy Arabia, because you could have a population there. It was a center of civilization. And so what we saw emerging in Yemen in the 60s was Republican government after the Zaydi Imamate was overthrown. And Yemen, as a result of this history, has a vibrant civil society in a way that you don't observe elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, given the history. In terms of the resistance to President Saleh, as you mentioned, it was visible in the street. Unfortunately, the last time I was in Yemen was a long time ago. It was 2010. But I remember there were sit-ins and demonstrations similar to what you might observe elsewhere in places like Cairo, for example. But it wasn't until the Arab Spring that we did see this massive mobilization against Saleh. And what was different about Yemen, whereas somewhere like Tunisia or Cairo, where the presidents were forced out of power within a matter of weeks, Saleh tenaciously hung on, as he had done for decades at that point. He was one of the longest lasting Arab rulers until he was finally ousted. The protests began in early 2011, and over the course of that year, Saleh kept saying he was going to step down after 30 days. There was an assassination attempt in June. He was determined to hang on, and it was only towards the end of 2011 that we saw the GCC get involved. Saleh ends up flying to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, to sign this GCC agreement.
What does that stand for?
The GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes all 6 Arab monarchies on the Arabian Peninsula. It notably excludes Yemen. Yemen has historically wanted to be part of the GCC, but it is not. The GCC itself was formed to facilitate Gulf cooperation, as its name implies. So after this long drawn-out process, Saleh finally formally hands over power to his deputy, who became President Hadi. And at that point, we see the beginning of something called the National Dialogue Conference. It was supported by the UN as well as the GCC. And this, at the time, was seen as a really admirable example of how a country was dealing with its political transition. It was seen as very representative, included a lot of civil society groups.
They drafted a constitution, right?
Yes, they drafted a constitution. They tried to address things like the Southern question, for example, the fact that, again, Southern Yemenis were frustrated with the power consolidation in the north. And one thing that came out of the National Dialogue Conference was this agreement that Yemen would become a federated system of 6 different regions. And this reflected the reality in Yemen. There are very distinctive regional differences. And the hope was that a federated system would allow for a more just form of government where you wouldn't see the same sort of power consolidation that Saleh had practiced for so long. Unfortunately, that process was considered unsatisfactory both by the Houthis as well as by the Southerners, by the Al-Haraq movement, which people may have heard of the Southern Transitional Council. The Haraq movement's most famous political outbranch is the STC.
And are they separatists in the South?
Yes. So they would like to reestablish an independent South Yemen as previously existed.
Well, it's no surprise learning about these complexities, why it was so hard to agree to a constitution. So this this process fails, and is that what leads to open conflict about, what is it now, 7-8 years ago?
Yes. So when the Southern factions and the Houthis rejected the outcome of the NDC, the Southerners felt that this was inadequate autonomy for them. And the Houthis rejected the federated system in part because they felt that it would divide Yemen into poor and wealthy regions, consigning them to have to stay in Saada, this northern part of Yemen where they're from, which is very resource poor. Also, a Houthi representative to the National Dialogue Conference was assassinated. So already this was quite contentious and then ultimately rejected. As I mentioned before, part of the reason we then saw the Houthi takeover was because President Hadi was supposed to only stay in power for 2 years. When he was elected president, he ran unopposed. And so already there was a question there. He really was just supposed to be this interim figure. And so he lacked the legitimacy of staying beyond that mandate. And so this was one of the reasons that triggered the Houthi incursions into Sana'a. Another major reason was the fact that the Houthis were supported by former President Saleh, who, as I mentioned, was very loath to step down and was finagling behind the scenes to try to get himself reinstated.
Right, because he opposed them at first, and then he switched alliances.
Exactly. Well, Saleh and the Houthis had fought this series of wars against each other in the early 2000s. And so initially, when he was partnering with the Houthis, it was not out in the open. And so it was initially something of a mystery why the Yemeni army, for example, didn't push back against the Houthis when in September of 2014, the Houthis took control of the capital. And initially, the Houthis were not powerful enough to unilaterally seize power. They had taken control of Sana'a, but they still needed partners in a power sharing agreement. So the UN brokered a deal to form a unity government.
And this unity government did not last very long, right?
It did not last. And again, it was widely rejected. When the Houthis took control of Sana'a, you had massive protests elsewhere in Yemen. At the same time, you had people in Sana'a protesting in favor of the Houthis.
To my earlier point, based on this history and the current factionalism, it seems to me, and I don't know very much about this, that the country is ungovernable by a single central government. Maybe a federalist system would make more sense. So there was an agreement, the Riyadh Agreement in 2019. I know we're bouncing around a little bit here, but we're getting back toward present day. There was a Riyadh Agreement in 2019. By this time, Saleh has been killed, right? But what was that agreement in 2019 supposed to do?
Well, let's back up a little bit because
Sure.
At this point, the Houthis have taken over. They eventually force President Hadi to flee, and they're partnering with President Saleh. This is what then precipitates the Saudi-led intervention in March of 2015. The UN, within weeks after the Saudi-led intervention begins, issues UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which remains the operative framework within which the international community engages with Yemen, which essentially calls out the Houthis, says they're the problem, and legitimizes this Saudi-led military intervention to kick the Houthis out and reinstate Hadi. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the intervening 7 years is the Houthis are good at fighting, and they're also an indigenous movement. And so because you have this foreign Saudi-led intervention attacking Yemen and also blockading Yemen, you have a dynamic in some ways somewhat similar to the Taliban, where you have an otherwise somewhat radical fringe group that most of the population would not necessarily be in favor of, but because they are fighting against this foreign incursion, they have the legitimacy of the national defender, and they're good at fighting. And so the Houthis have actually grown much stronger in the intervening 7 years. They hold much more territory now. And part of what's ironic is when the Saudis intervened in 2015, they were partly worried because Iran was offering some support to the Houthis. And the irony is that Iran now offers a lot more support to the Houthis than they did at that point.
That's
and
how
so
wars go.
The Saudi motivation of trying to prevent Iran from establishing what they would see as a sort of a client state or a Hezbollah-like state in Yemen, that situation is much worse from the Saudi perspective. The Houthis themselves have their own reasons for fighting. I think people say, well, why would Iran let the Houthis fire on Abu Dhabi right now when Iranian-Emirati relations were improving? And the point is, Iran didn't allow the Houthis to do anything. At this point, they've sort of empowered them and given them missiles and given them the know-how to build relatively cheap drones that it is then very expensive for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to try to defend against, because they're using American-made Patriot anti-missile systems, which are incredibly more expensive than the little drones.
That's a mistake often made, looking at an indigenous force like the Houthis and only assuming they're being controlled by puppet strings. And thank you for redirecting me there and reminding me about 2015 being such a key point here. The Saudi-led coalition intervenes, and it seems backward to me that the UN would sanction that.
Well, and again, at the time, the UN had been involved in this national transition process and the National Dialogue Conference, which again had gotten so much international approbation. And Yemen was really seen as a model for including civil society groups and women's groups and trying to pursue this time-consuming and often very frustrating process of hammering out the details of a new form of governance. Unfortunately, since then, the power has been with the guys with the guns, even in terms of the way the UN is now trying to broker an agreement, or when Special Envoy Lender King tries to negotiate. It is just reinforcing the fact that those with guns are the ones who are at the negotiating table. And there has been inadequate efforts to try to bring back Yemen's vibrant civil society to also have them at the table. And this is somewhat understandable because obviously you need a ceasefire to be in place before you can start hammering out any details of a post-conflict scenario. I think there are many people in Yemen who still hold on to this belief that we'd started something really promising here and we want to get back to that. The reality at this point is that is all years and years in the past, and circumstances have very unfortunately changed.
Yeah, sometimes there are no possible good solutions. After 7 years of civil war, so much damage has been done. The consequences of these past 7 years has been a dire humanitarian crisis. So, as you explained, the Saudis have their own reasons for wanting to get the Houthis out of power. Whether they're valid or not, they have their reasons. To the average American listening to this, why does the United States care who controls Sana'a? Why does the United States support a Saudi-led air war that has been utterly disastrous and shameful?
So this gets back to the broader geopolitical circumstances of 2015. So at the time, the Obama administration was in the process of trying to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA. The terms of that deal just focused on the nuclear issue. And it's important, again, to keep in mind when we hear criticisms of, why doesn't the Iran deal include other activities by the Iranians, their meddling or support for militia groups around the region or their missile program. And the point is that Prior to negotiating the JCPOA, neither the Israelis nor the Gulf countries wanted these other issues to be on the table. Israel wanted it to focus exclusively on their main concern, which was the nuclear question. And the Gulf countries, because they knew that they weren't going to be at the table, they didn't want decisions being made about regional security if they weren't going to be there to have a say. So it's frustrating sometimes when you hear criticisms now of the Iran nuclear deal for focusing exclusively on the nuke question. The point is that that was sort of agreed in advance, that it was just going to focus on that. So the Obama administration hoped that if the US sent some measure of support to the Saudis, at the time this included mid-air refueling, for example, for Saudi jets, just allowing them to be more efficient in their runs, dropping bombs on Yemen, as well as intelligence support, spare parts and maintenance support, because the Saudi Air Force is very dependent in majority American made and very much depends on American contractors to keep Saudi planes flying. And so Obama hoped that if the US supported the Saudi-led war, the Saudis would rein in their criticism of the Iran nuclear deal. There was also a misperception that this would be a very quick war, that Mohammed bin Salman, who at the time was defense minister, believed this would be a feather in his cap as he was trying to make the case for why he should be crown prince. He thought he would have this glorious victory over this ragtag group of rebels in Yemen. And yet here we are, Mohammed bin Salman is indeed crown prince, but he's also still at war in Yemen. And
add that to the long list of wars that took a lot longer than the perpetrators believed they would. But
exactly.
Go ahead.
Exactly. And again, unfortunately, as you mentioned, circumstances in Yemen were obviously already so complicated. It will already be very difficult to reach a resolution within just the Yemeni parties themselves, but it becomes infinitely more difficult when it then is the result of foreign resources flowing in. Essentially, none of the groups on the ground have any incentive to stop fighting because they just keep getting resources from the Saudis, the Emiratis, from Iran on the other side. And fighting has worked, essentially, whereas there's really no incentive to negotiate, in part because the war economy has enriched so many of these players on the ground to the devastation of the ordinary Yemeni. I mean, we have 16 million people on the brink of starvation and millions more at risk of starvation.
16 million, you said?
Yes.
Out of a population of about 50 million?
30 million total in Yemen. And again, 24 million people, about 80% of Yemen's population, live under Houthi control. So one issue your listeners may have heard of is this possible redesignation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. This was something that
won't complicate anything.
This was something that the Trump administration had threatened to do, but only actually did in the very last moment of his presidency, essentially because Pompeo and Trump knew that it would be a debacle for the United States to be held responsible for the starvation of Yemenis if they had imposed that designation earlier, because what that would do would be to prevent any kind of commercial or humanitarian activity in areas controlled by the Houthis. And so you would be consigning these 24 million people that live under their control essentially to starvation.
Yes.
And so again, what's ironic now is that the Biden administration lifted that designation almost immediately, to much praise from the humanitarian community, who knew that the FTO designation was not actually going to do much to constrain the Houthis, but would be devastating for the millions of people that live under their control. But now the Biden administration is considering reinstating this designation and taking on that responsibility in a way that abrogates the responsibility of the Houthis, who themselves are also responsible for blocking aid and who have done horrific things to the people of Yemen. But this would allow them to shift all of that blame onto the United States.
Why has it been so difficult to end U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia? As an American citizen, I think it's disgraceful that the United States is backing what the Saudis are doing there.
The Saudis are America's biggest customer in terms of weapons sales. And the weapons lobby in this country is very powerful. And unfortunately, we see that reflected in things like our ballooning defense budget. So it's not only about our weapons sales elsewhere, it's also how much money Congress allocates each year, which I believe it was $778 billion just for this year alone. So we're approaching $1 trillion a year.
True.
For the Department of Defense.
But President Biden early on said it was time to end this war and end U.S. support. Politically speaking, he could have done that. I don't think American citizens would have opposed that move. I don't think American citizens think about Yemen very often and what's going on there and U.S. complicity. He had a political opening to do so, but here we are. The U.S. is still selling weapons to Saudi Arabia to perpetrate this cruel war.
A year ago was when Biden made that statement.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
Unfortunately, that offensive-defensive distinction has ended up doing a lot of work, such that the U.S. did end up authorizing over $1 billion in new weapon sales to the Saudis last year under the rubric that they were defensive. But again, the U.S. has already sold hundreds of billions of dollars of offensive weapons to the Saudis. So the fact that over the past 12 months, the U.S. only sold some attack helicopters and air-to-air missiles, again, just signals the fact that the U.S. continues to support what Saudi Arabia is doing because the Biden administration does remain concerned about Iran, and they do remain concerned about this crucial waterway. And the U.S., it's been very clear from statements from the State Department, from Special Envoy Lender King, the U.S. tends to only condemn acts of atrocities by the Houthis, and they just express concern when the Saudis launch an air strike that kills 90 people in one go, for example, as recently happened when they struck a detention facility.
90 people, oh my God.
And so in general, the U.S. is quite clear that rather than acting as a neutral arbiter here, which initially seemed to be what Biden was saying, that's the role he wanted the U.S. to play, he's maintaining this Trump policy of just open support for the Saudis, allowing weapon sales through. This idea that we're not going to sell them offensive weapons, I don't consider at all convincing because it's...
What's a defensive versus an offensive weapon? I mean,
Exactly.
There's another U.S. concern in Yemen, and that is the ability to fire drones into that country to kill people whom the United States says are terrorists or plotting attacks, etc.
Listeners may or may not recall that there was an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a Yemeni cleric born in New Mexico, or born in the U.S., lived in New Mexico.
That's right.
Who was murdered by a targeted assassination, by a drone attack. Later, his children were also killed.
That was during the Obama years.
Yes.
Abrogating the Bill of Rights by assassinating an American citizen under the justification that he was plotting attacks against the U.S. and recruiting people to do that.
Death of al-Awlaki is a major blow to al-Qaeda's most active operational affiliate. Al-Awlaki was the leader of external operations for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In that role, he took the lead in planning and directing efforts to murder innocent Americans.
Part of the question there was under what legal justification was the Obama administration able to carry out this attack on Yemen? They used the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which remains the operating legal framework under which the U.S. ends up conducting military exercises all over the world. I mean, it's, the attack, for example, in Niger, where American service members were killed. And there was this question of who knew Americans were even in Niger.
Members of Congress didn't know that.
Right. And so, unfortunately, what we've heard recently, General McKenzie, or CENTCOM Commander General McKenzie, told the UAE in an interview that the U.S. is planning to attack targets in Yemen to prevent the Houthis from being able to launch drones and missiles, meaning that they're going to fire upon Yemen. Up to this point, the U.S. has merely sold the weapons, offered intelligence support, offered maintenance support, so that the Saudis and the Emiratis can bomb. But it hasn't been Americans flying those planes and dropping those bombs. And now what it sounds like may be happening is McKenzie saying that the U.S. is going to escalate our involvement, the direct involvement of Americans killing Yemenis. There are absolutely going to be civilian casualties if the U.S. adopts this posture of trying to prevent the Houthis from firing drones. The point here being that if the Saudis and the Emiratis withdrew and said, look, we're tired of this, it's not worth it anymore for us, we're just going to let the Yemenis work it out for themselves, the Houthis have no reason to continue to fire. The UAE had withdrawn most of its military forces at the end of 2019, and we saw no more attacks directed at the UAE until recently, when the UAE recommitted, re-engaged, offered a lot more support to militias on the ground that had then, over the past few weeks, had retaken important territory. And so the Houthis responded by saying, hey, go back to what you were doing before, where you were just in the south, watching over this important waterway and supporting this autonomous movement for Southern secession. But now that you're directly engaging us again, we're going to start firing on you again.
I'm not an expert on military history, but I do know that trying to win a war through the use of air power alone is very difficult, and that seems to be what the Saudi approach has been for years now. Two more points I'd like to raise with you. Briefly first, you've done field work in Yemen. It's been a few years, but you have, across the Middle East as well. What is popular opinion like in Yemen? Do the Houthis have popular support? They must have some, but is it enough to, say, stabilize things?
Well, that is a big question. On the one hand, you'll sometimes see these massive demonstrations allegedly in support of the Houthis, people out chanting in the streets in Sana'a. On the other hand, they are a very violent group. And so there are probably many people in those crowds who need to show up in order to avoid any sort of problems for themselves. And again, Yemen's vibrant civil society very much opposes the Houthis, in part because one of the Houthis' goals is to revert Yemen back to the system of a ruling hierarchy that had existed back before the Republic of Yemen was established back in the 60s. And this was based on essentially those who were in charge were descended from the Prophet Muhammad. So the Houthis want to go back to this system of descendancy-based rule that specific families would be in charge. And there are many in Yemen who say that this is not who we are. We had a republic, even if it was very flawed and deeply corrupt. But Yemen historically had a very vibrant press, for example, an independent press in the 90s. And so there are many in Yemen who completely reject this vision that the Houthis have. If by some miracle, the US and the Saudis and the Emiratis all pulled out and control of the civil war really was returned to Yemenis, we likely would see conflict continue for a while. But the point is that eventually that would end. They wouldn't work out a modus vivendi between them. Again, probably the Southerners would demand either an independent South Yemen or perhaps just an autonomous region. And the Houthis would have to work out some kind of power sharing agreement, because the perception of Houthi empowerment, again, is partly inflated by the fact that they're fighting against foreign intervention and foreign aggression. And if that were to go away, I think you'd see a lot of support for the Houthis evaporate, and also just resistance to poor governance. And there would be demands for, we have to keep the lights on and the water flowing, and we need to rebuild this devastated country. And the Houthis, again, have mostly demonstrated that they're good at fighting. Unclear that they would be particularly talented at governing.
There may be an important parallel there to the Taliban, who are now in charge of governing their country. So here in the U.S., we have this thing called the War Powers Act, passed in 1973 after Nixon and Kissinger secretly bombed Cambodia. It was meant to rein in executive overreach when it comes to war making, but it's rarely, if ever, been successfully invoked. And it came up during the Trump administration vis-a-vis Yemen. Is there any chance we might see Congress do its job and intervene here under the War Powers Act?
Yes. So in April or spring of 2019, we saw Congress successfully pass a War Powers resolution to end U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen, specifically to end support for Saudi aggression. And Trump vetoed that. And thus far, we've seen efforts by Congress to try to introduce measures, for example, in the National Defense Authorization Agreement, the NDAA, the must-pass bill that provides funding for the military each year. There's been a provision to end U.S. support for Saudi aggression introduced and successfully passing on the floor each year, and then each year it gets stripped out. And so this is why, in terms of a legislative path forward, a War Powers Act is seen as the only action that could actually finally end U.S. support for Saudi intervention here. And we just heard earlier this week that Representatives Jayapal and DeFazio committed to introducing a war powers resolution. They're looking for support on the Senate side and obviously need support from a lot of other members of Congress if this is going to pass. And the question, unfortunately, is in 2019, this was a way for Democrats, all Democrats voted for it, and some Republicans to signal their opposition to Trump, to say, we are tired of this unconditional support you're providing for the Saudis, and we are going to pass this war powers resolution to try to constrain you. And then it was vetoed. The question now is, will Democrats go against Biden as the leader of their party to say, we reject the fact that you have continued a lot of Trump's policies, and in particular, if the U.S. does begin engaging in direct military strikes on Yemen, this would significantly elevate the level of U.S. involvement and would potentially galvanize enough congressional resistance to say, this is unconscionable. We cannot continue to devastate this country where already 400,000 people have died as a result of this war.
Maybe I was naive when President Biden somewhat eloquently stated the case for ending forever war in Afghanistan, trying to get the United States citizenry to wake up to this reality that we have other problems to deal with right now, and we can't have multi-generational wars for which there is no end in sight.
You know, I think it is encouraging to see, especially from younger people, millennials, my generation, as well as Gen Zers, who do very much reject this notion that the U.S. needs to sort of lead with the military, and instead polls show that they would prefer sort of more diplomatic engagement. In contrast, we tend to see, I think, more of a support for this American military supremacy among older people who are perhaps more accustomed to that or more accustomed to that working well. Whereas I think for younger people, they've observed for the past couple of decades how this approach just hasn't worked all that well for the U.S., from everything since 9/11, the endless wars in the Middle East, to now this inability to deal with threats like climate change, for example, the pandemic being the major issue where clearly the U.S. has struggled to actually preserve American security here at home. And the amount of resources that are being spent on these conflicts abroad, where it's really unclear to what extent is this actually crucial for the average American's well-being and security. I hope it's going to get harder and harder for the U.S. government to be able to convince Americans of that. But thus far, we aren't seeing much resistance to these ballooning Pentagon budgets.
You know, it's obviously crucial to the Yemenis. It's obviously crucial to Ukrainians and Russians, the fate of the Donbass region. But from a U.S. perspective, I often wonder, is there any part of the globe too insignificant to prevent the U.S. from intervening in a war or a conflict on one side or the other?
Many Americans do believe in this promise of the United States as being able to support a rules-based international order. And there are many people who want the U.S. to continue to play an important role around the world. But unfortunately, I think we sometimes conflate this notion of military supremacy with American overall support for trade and, sort of a functioning international order. And the point is that whenever the U.S. relies or over-relies on force, that is always going to provoke resistance. There will always be people who perceive this as illegitimate foreign involvement, who resent American meddling. Whereas one of the things that's been interesting about Chinese success in establishing the Belt and Road Initiative and in reaching out to countries all over the world, they lead with the economics. They lead with development, and they also don't bring human rights concerns to the table, which is something a lot of countries in the Middle East are very welcoming of. But again, I think sometimes there's just this mismatch that Americans are sort of accustomed to American power in the world being meted out through our military, as opposed to going back to some of the other things that people do admire about America, democratic values, and that in theory, we do support human rights. Although again, unfortunately, in the Middle East, we tend to see arms sales always taking precedence over actual human rights concerns.
There's an old quote often attributed to Franklin Roosevelt, although I don't know if he ever actually said this, referring to dictators supported by the United States. He might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Right. And, a lot of that came out of the Cold War, I think, where we were locked in this ostensibly existential conflict with the USSR. We do still have a lot of that sort of a mentality, even though at this point it's not competing with a military power that is aiming nukes at us. I mean, certainly there are concerns about China's rise, but a lot of that is more about China's economic power and the fact that the US is going to have to accustom ourselves to the reality of a multipolar world where we can't throw our weight around in the way that we had been accustomed to doing since the fall of the USSR. And it's going to take a fundamental shift in Americans' understanding of our role in the world. And I just fear that the more the US relies on military force, the more resistance we're going to provoke. And the more appealing the sort of China model will look, where they practice sort of non-intervention in other countries' domestic affairs, and they mostly pursue economic partnerships.
Dr. Annelle Sheline, we thank you for your expertise on the Middle East. On the next episode of History as It Happens, are you familiar with the history of the rabbis who have prayed before Congress? How about that for a unique topic? We're going to speak to someone who may be the only expert on the subject, an expert on the rabbis who blessed Congress. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.